Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Brett Williams, and this is my 1-year update, learning Japanese with MIA. Now, I'm sure some of you are aware that MIA actually is no longer. The founders, MattVsJapan and Yoga, they had a falling out, and they've separated. Yoga is doing his own thing, Migaku, and MattVsJapan, I'm assuming, is also doing his own thing, and right now he's just MattVsJapan. He's still got all of his videos. He's got his Discord, and Migaku also has their Discord and are creating tools. And I believe, I can't say for sure, but from my understanding, Matt is also kind of still pursuing the idea of creating an all-encompassing language learning method. He's going to do it under a new brand, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't know when that will happen, but that should be happening soon. But until then, I've done MIA for the last 6 months. I'm going to be referring to it as MIA right now because that's what I did. And until the new system comes out, that's what I'll continue to refer to it as because technically that's what I'm doing. The MIA website is still up. So anybody that needs their language learning needs fulfilled, it is still there for us to use. So that is very good. Some people have been asking for my opinion on the whole thing. I really don't have one. I've had enough experience with relationships, whether it be professional or personal, to know that rarely do these incidents happen and it's like an evil person and a good person. Generally, it tends to be a mixture of both people feeling like something was done to them, and usually they're both right to a certain extent. So I don't really see the point. Matt has always been a great guy to me. Yoga has always been a great guy to me. I wasn't there, so I really see no need to pick sides. I'm going to continue to support both of them. I think Migaku is going to be coming out with amazing tools, and I'm confident Matt is going to be putting out amazing language learning theory videos and content around that. So with that being said, let's move on to the video, which is the most important part, hopefully. So here's kind of the outline of things that I want to touch on today. One, where I feel like I'm at in the process. Two, some pitfalls and roadblocks that I've come across along the way. I want to just document some of them. I don't have answers to some of these pitfalls and roadblocks, but I want to document them just so that later on, if I do feel like I've overcome these things, I have a record to show like, yeah, I came across that too, but it works itself out, so don't worry. So that way I can help other people later that are kind of going through the same things that I am. I'll then talk about advice for people that I feel like are in phase 1 or just starting off with their language learning journey. People that are doing an input method, specifically MIA or whatever the new branded method is. And yeah, and then I'll talk about the monolingual transition, which is something that I have now pretty much done. I feel quite confident in the monolingual dictionary, although I still have some ways to go, but I feel quite confident in it. And then I'll talk about my experiments, including the results of the 4-tier system, which many people were interested in after my last video. Spoiler alert, it failed. So I'll talk about that as well as some other experiments that I'm doing now. And then that's it. So first, where I'm at now and where I feel like I'm at in the process. I definitely feel like I made less progress in these last 6 months than the first 6 months. I think that's partially just due to the fact that the first 6 months, I already had a base, and then as I started doing all this input, all these words that I knew now became recognizable to me in native content because I got used to it, and so it felt like I was making a ton of progress really quickly. I think also my lack of progress in these last 6 months is not a fault of the method, but a fault of 1, me experimenting, which I like doing, and 2, focus, which I'm going to talk about in pitfalls and stuff. But in short, I feel like, unfortunately, I got caught in this cycle of not being focused enough during my immersion and just kind of checking off the boxes of, you know, oh, I got to get my 3 hours done, instead of actually checking off the boxes of, I need to deconstruct Japanese. But we'll talk about that more later. Let's go over some. First, I want to go over some just like raw numbers. My average flashcard time per day was 1.5 hours. My average immersion time per day was 2 hours and 45 minutes. I wanted to get that to 3 hours. I actually wanted that to be above 3 hours, but unfortunately, I did get really, really busy this last month and missed some some days, unfortunately, but it's better than my 2-hour average that I did during my first 6 months, so I'm really happy about that. And then my next 6 months, I want to get that up to 3 or above. My partial active listening was 9 minutes per day, but I knew that that was going to be low because pretty much any time I'm not studying, I'm working. And anytime I'm doing laundry or working out or doing other things that don't have to focus on, I'm like audiobooking for our podcast, or I'm doing, or I'm listening to other podcasts that are work related and stuff like that. So I want to get my partial listening up a little bit, but I don't think I'm gonna be able to. I average 4 hours and 20 minutes a day of Japanese study, flashcards and immersion combined. So I'm happy about that. I think that's good. It's only 10 minutes short of my daily goal, but I want to get that up. Now, here's the bad news. I'm at 3,000 sentences. At the end of 6 months, I was at 3,500 sentences. So the 4-tier system ended up resulting, well, not just the 4-tier system, but the 4-tier system, along with also some other issues that I ended up having with my Anki deck, partially due to an add-on that I was using that was messing with scheduling, and just me being a little OCD about like, well, this is all messed up. I ended up just scrapping my Anki deck. I don't recommend this to anybody, but I just wanted to start fresh with this new system that I'm doing, and that put me behind in the SRS a little bit, but I do feel like even those words that aren't in my SRS anymore, when I come across them again, they'll be acquired or they'll be learned a little bit easier because I've already been exposed to them. So I don't think it's a huge loss, but from pure raw numbers, I am behind on the SRS quite a bit. I wanted to be at 7,000 words by now. I'm only at 3,000, but I'm confident with my current system, and I'm confident that if my current system doesn't work out, but we'll talk about that in the experiments later. But so in the last video, I talked about that I wanted to be ready to output at this point. Now, because of some of these setbacks, I definitely don't feel like I'm ready to output, but even if I didn't have these setbacks, I don't think I'd be ready to output. I think I underestimated how long it's going to take to get ready to output. I'm hoping that I'll be ready to output in another year. I feel like that's kind of on pace with 3 hours a day. You should be maybe ready to output at about the 2-year mark, maybe. But I thought I'd be ready to output, right now, and I definitely don't feel anywhere close to being able to output. Why don't I feel like I'm ready to output? Well, when I go to try and make Japanese sentences in my head, I'm still constructing. I'm still constructing from old Genki rules and old habits that I had. And also, when I input, I'm nowhere near 100%, which is kind of what, MattVsJapan recommends you be at before you start kind of like shadowing and getting ready to, shadowing and getting ready to output. And I don't feel like I'm anywhere near that. I feel like on really easy shows like Nannan Byori and New Game and other slice of life stuff, I feel like I understand so much more than I did. But I still feel like while at 6 months I was probably at like 50%, I feel like I'm at maybe like 70 to 80%. So I wanted to make a little bit more progress than that in the last 6 months, but and I think partially I didn't make as much progress as I wanted because of my focus that I'll talk about later, but I think also because just the fact that I think it's just realistically going to take longer than I expected. So I don't think this is a problem with the method. I think it's just my expectations on top of focus, which again I'll talk about later. But how am I feeling? I'm feeling still really optimistic about MIA as a method. I've noticed that as long as I feel like most of the things that I end up getting frustrated about are self-inflicted because I like experimenting, and self-inflicted because I didn't focus enough. So let me get into that then. The pitfalls. The first pitfall I want to talk about obviously is focus because I've been mentioning it. I've noticed that because I'm very, very busy and I have to actively take away from other work in order to make time for Japanese, I noticed that my mind was wandering a lot. I was still thinking about other work. I was still, if I got a work-related email or text or something like that, I would check it. I would still even though I was in my immersion mode, I wasn't 100% focused on immersion. So I feel like for the first 4 months, I almost got caught in this thing of like, well, I need to get my 3 hours of immersion done. And my mind would still be on work. My mind would still be on other ideas. And while this is better than no immersion at all, I feel like this is more like passive immersion. I feel like for the first 4 months of the last 6 months, I got stuck in this trap of basically just almost always passively immersing because my mind was rarely fully focused. And when I realized that this was happening, because 2 months ago I was really kind of frustrated that I didn't make more progress, I really started noticing how much my focus was detrimented because it was on other work. So I made that a priority over the last 2 months, and I've really noticed the benefit. The closer, I mean, this is so common sense, but like I think it's good to keep in mind that you can't get caught in this trap of 3 hours a day means fluency in 3 years, you know? Because really, probably 1 hour, well, maybe not, but 1 hour a day of fully focused, 100% completely focused in the zone immersion is going to be better than probably 3 hours of like checking your phone, thinking of other things, picking up a word here and there. Because it's more like really passive immersion. Now, it's a gradient. There were other times that I was closer, but my main priority for active immersion now is to really try and focus, really get my mind focused on it. And it was hard at first, but as I do it more and more, I'm getting much better at getting back in that groove where I'm not thinking about checking off 3 hours a day. I'm thinking about learning the language. And one of the things that helped me do that was reminding myself why I wanted to learn Japanese. But I'm going to talk about that more in my tips for people that are starting phase 1 in a second. So that's my main pitfall that I think was detrimental, was just focus and making sure that even though you can't be 100% focused at all times, the closer you can be to 100% focused and the closer you can be to actually being interested in the material and wanting to learn the language rather than just checking off some arbitrary boxes of time invested, the more benefit you're going to get. So just really make sure that you're focusing on actually learning Japanese and not just putting in arbitrary time. Because I think especially when you're really busy outside of it, you can feel like, well, I have to fit this in, instead of, oh, I really want to learn Japanese. So the other pitfall that I've come across is this idea that, like, at times I feel like I'm really, really good at the language. Like, there's certain episodes where I'm just like, man, dude, I understood almost everything. And then in, like, the same show 2 episodes later, I'll feel like I didn't understand a word. Like, I followed the story, but, like, I just feel like there's so much I don't know yet. And I think it's really, really important just to remind yourself to focus on those moments that you're killing it and take notes and remind yourself of that. Like, you know, hey, don't forget episode whatever, you understood all of that. And have, like, you know, a way to remind yourself that you actually are still learning something. Because I think our minds are kind of geared towards automatically going towards the things that we don't know. And when you come across those episodes, it, like, I just sometimes feel like I'm never going to learn this language. Like, I just feel like there's so much to learn. And I feel like I've been already dedicating so much time that, like, there's just certain times where I just feel like, have I learned anything in the past year at all? And I have to, like, actively sit there and remind myself that I have. Because I didn't understand anything. There was never a point when I first started MIA where I was like, yeah, man, I had a good episode. I understood all of that. There was never that point where that happened. So that's also a roadblock that I kind of come up against, is this idea of, like, getting in a mode where I feel like I'm never going to do it. I still haven't gotten over that. That still happens sometimes, but luckily I don't let it affect my motivation. I'm still really dedicated to learning Japanese, and I'm very confident, because this has happened to me in other things like Taekwondo, I'm very confident that it'll be overcome. So let's see. Another thing is reading. So I've switched to reading cards, and reading cards that are vocab level with context on the back. My brain was I would have words that were like 7 months, like, that I've gotten right the last, like, 6 times I've come across them in the SRS, but I would not even recognize them as words that I knew until I looked them up in the SRS or in immersion. I'd be like, okay, well, I don't know this word, and I'd look it up and I'd recognize the definition, not the word. So I, like, wouldn't even recognize it as a word that I have seen before. And that just seems crazy to me that in the SRS, I would get it. So I switched to vocab level cards. And if you look here, what I mean by vocab level cards is vocabulary, no context on the front.
彼はとても誠実な人です。
誠実
with context on the back. Okay? So I still get the context. Like, you can't just learn it in isolation. You need to have context for the word. But I feel like it's beneficial to me to remove all of this context when I'm being tested on it and have to remember the context as part of the vocabulary. That way I really process it as an individual word. And now I notice that I'm really noticing things in immersion much quicker. And I like that because I get almost all of my learning and acquisition from immersion, because words that I can perfect in the SRS, I often forget in immersion. So it's like really the immersion and multiple contexts that I get it. So being able to accelerate the rate that I recognize it and then really master it in immersion is really beneficial to me, because it got really frustrating. This is one of the reasons that I did the 4-tier system, and we'll talk about why that failed, and this is my solution to that. And so far, I really, really like it. Matt ended up at like a couple months after I started doing this, Matt ended up doing a video talking about this. He doesn't like it as much, and I understand why. It definitely makes the SRS more annoying, but I really like it because, like I said, it makes my immersion time better. So that's one thing that happens. Another thing that I come across is that is kind of a pitfall that I think some of you might also come across, is when you're reading, recognizing something at first, but then as more things come in that are similar, having it tank your understanding of the first thing. So an example of this is tsunao. So I first was introduced to tsunao, and tsunao has this first kanji that is very recognizable. That first kanji is what my brain attached to remember this word. And it would be like, oh, that kanji means tsunao, okay? So that's how I did it, and I got it right the first time, second time, third time, fourth time, fifth time. Then in my immersion, I added shiroto. Now, shiroto, the very first kanji is the same exact kanji, but my brain associated that kanji specifically with tsunao. So now I'm getting shiroto wrong. But now when tsunao comes up, I'm like, okay, this is shiroto, right? Because shiroto is now that word, and that's in the rotation. And then that would come up, no, that's tsunao. So my brain had to go to further levels of detail. Now, seeing them side by side, obviously, it's very clear that they're different. But because my brain attached to a broad understanding of it, it was hard for me to distinguish them. And then once I started seeing them and getting them wrong, my brain's like, okay, I have to go to further detail. And then it started noticing the second one is different. And then it just became a matter of which one do I attach each of these second kanjis to. So now it went to further detail to further clarify something it thought it knew. And I've noticed this happen with a ton of things. Zashi and fukuzatsu, same thing. Let's see. And that's kind of like some of the major pitfalls that I've come across. I got some more pitfalls when we talk about monolingual transition, but those will be specific to that section. So now I want to talk about my advice for people in phase 1 or just starting MIA or whatever it's going to be called, input learning, MattVsJapan method. So the first thing I want to talk about, like I said before, is focus. Really pay attention to focusing and having high quality immersion time. Don't get caught in this trap, especially if you're busy. It's easy to get caught in this trap of, well, I have to fit in my immersion for the day. But the important part isn't the immersion, right? I mean, the immersion is the important part, but if you just have it sitting in the background, playing, that's better than nothing, but it's going to be like just such a small benefit, 1/10 of the benefit of you being completely focused, right? So yes, it's good to be exposed to the language as much as possible, but as much as possible that you can be, like, I feel like you get exponentially more benefit the closer you are to 100% focus. And by 100% focus, I mean whatever phase you're at. Like, in the beginning, it was just picking out the sounds, being able to hear when one word starts and ends, being able to actually hear the phonic sounds. Then I started picking out words. Oh, I recognize that word. Well, that's not a word I know. That's not a word. Oh, I recognize that word. Then it's starting, like, trying to understand it at a sentence level. Then it's trying to understand it at, like, a bigger level where this sentence starts to compound in this sentence, you understand the whole meaning. I feel like those are the phases that I'm going through. I'm still pretty much at the sentence level, but a lot of times I'll come across, little things where I'm going at a much larger level as well, and everything's starting to make sense because I understand everything. So just really focus on working on your focus. And if you have a problem with focus, maybe create like an alarm on your phone that goes off every 5 minutes and reminds you to focus, something like that. Another thing that I found helps with my focus is reminding myself why I want to learn the language. I actually have a little piece of paper now that I look at before I do my flashcards and before I do my immersion that says, this is why you want to learn. Now, those reasons are personal, but let me use an example that isn't my reason. Like, let's say your reason is, you love anime and you want to go to Japan and live there and, meet a Japanese girl and get married and live there forever. Well, write that down on a piece of paper and make it sound really good. The goal of this isn't to pretend that learning Japanese is the solution to all your problems, because it won't be. If you're not happy without Japanese, you won't be happy with Japanese. But the point of this is just to have something that reminds you that learning the language is the focus, not the time invested. So just make sure you're constantly reminding yourself of that and work on building up your focus like a muscle over time. Maybe at first you can only really focus for 5 minutes, but eventually you want to get it so that you're as close to 100% focus for your full immersion time as humanly possible. It's impossible to be focused for a full 9 hours if you're doing that, but the closer you are to 100%, the more benefit you're going to be getting. And that was kind of a trap that I fell into, was thinking the time was important more so than the focus. I also think making pitfall lists, like these pitfalls that I mentioned before, is really really beneficial. This is kind of like a thing I've started doing recently, is anytime I come across something, like for example, tsunao in shiroto, I write it down. I don't do this every time, but every now and then I'll write it down on a master list and write some notes like, this is really frustrating. I keep getting these wrong. I don't know why I can't tell the difference. When I see them side by side, they look super, super different, but anytime I come across them in immersion or in my SRS, I keep getting them mixed up. And that's it. And then I'll have that as an entry. And every now and then I'll just keep adding things that are just really frustrating to me and annoying, because then I can go back 4 months later, 5 months later, and this helps with my motivation, because I look at these things and I laugh. It's like, oh my gosh, you thought that was hard? And because now it's so easy. And this is a good way, I think, to remind you that you're making progress. You know how I was talking about before, how sometimes I just feel like I'm not making any progress. This has been something that has helped me with that, where I can actually look at things that I have a journal entry for that's like, oh, you know that completely fine now. And you'll also probably have a lot that you still need to work on, like, oh, that's still hard for me. But you'll also start adding things on that are really easy for you. Let's see. Another thing that I would recommend for people just starting off is the idea of look up a list of culturally significant kid shows like Doraemon and watch it early. Because I feel like you outgrow them relatively quickly. I'm watching it now and it's kind of hard for me to watch because I understand enough of it that it's not super interesting to me. But I feel like if I watched it earlier, I could have gotten a lot of exposure to this culturally significant show before I realized I'm not really interested in the show itself. So I've watched 10 episodes of it now, and I'm kind of moving on. But yeah, I think that's good. Another thing I wish I knew earlier was I think the most important thing is that you have interest in something. So if you don't have interest in this thing, don't do it. But if you're interested in slice of life, I feel like that's really good stuff for phase 1, especially end of phase 1. I feel like I'm getting way more useful sentences from manageable content like slice of life than I am from just stuff that's way out of my wheelhouse. Even if I'm somewhat interested in it, because I do find these other animes still interesting. I feel like I really like just finding something in my wheelhouse. I don't think it's worth procrastinating over. If you can't find a show in 5 minutes, then just watch anything. Anything that looks interesting to you is going to be better than nothing, and something that's interesting to you is always going to be better than something that's not interesting to you. But if you can find something that's somewhat in your realm that quickly that you're interested in, I think that's going to be the best bang for your buck ideally. And then another thing that I recommend is context notes. I've been finding these really, really beneficial. One thing I do now is anytime I come across a card in my immersion, I just take a really quick context note. So this way, if I forget exactly the context of this word, because I've had this happen a couple times where like 6 months down the road I'll come across it. I'll think I'll remember the context forever, but 6 months down the road I'll come across it and I'll be like, oh, this idea is a little fuzzy. It's a little fuzzy to me. I don't know exactly how it's being used here. But then when I read my context note, it's like, oh, that's how it's being used. That's the sentence. That's kind of the feel of it being used in this sentence. And to me, that just makes it stick much better. So I'm taking these little context notes, and context note will be something as simple as like, in the last scene, she bought a coffee and then she walks in and her friend says this to her, something like that. And then it's like, gives context to it. So I found that to be pretty beneficial personally. All right. And then the last thing that I would recommend to people is, even if you don't have any interest in reading, make sure that you have reading in the mix. Being able to process the language at your own pace is really beneficial. And I've even gone so far as at this point is I have 2/3 of my immersion is reading and 1/3 of my immersion is listening. Although I think I'm going to start evening that out again now, because I feel like my reading is getting ahead of my listening. So yeah. Really don't ignore reading, even if you have to read with furigana and you don't care about kanji. Just get exposure to the language in manageable chunks like that. All right, now let's talk about the monolingual transition. So my experience with the monolingual transition was a little bit different. I like to distinguish between flashcard time and immersion time rather than just, doing my flashcards and then immersing. Like I said, because I have to give up work time in order to immerse, I'm sacrificing something to immerse. I need to be pretty strict with it. So I want to make sure that I'm getting my full 3 hours and not having flashcard time creep into that. So because of that, I didn't want to make monolingual cards early off. Because I found the monolingual cards took me so much longer. So what I did is I started off by looking up words that I knew in the monolingual dictionary as my immersion time. I started mining words that way from words that I knew, mining the definitions of words that I knew. This got me introduced to it, and this is nothing new. But then what I did is, rather than then move on to making monolingual cards and then adding monolingual into my immersion, I just went straight to doing monolingual immersion and only looking up the definition if I couldn't figure it out from the monolingual dictionary. This way, I could spend as much time on a definition that I wanted and mine from those definitions during my immersion time, because I felt like it was completely immersive, I wasn't spending any time not immersing. It was all monolingually. And the only time that I added monolingual definitions is when I felt like I understood the definition that I just found for a new word completely without adding any new words. Like it was, I read it, it was very fluid, and I knew that if I add that definition to my flashcards, it won't take me a ton of extra time during my flashcard repetitions. So that's kind of the approach that I took. And I kept doing that. And now I've gotten to the point where I would say 90% of my new cards are monolingual because I've gotten such a good handle on the monolingual dictionary. And I feel like it hasn't impacted my repetitions very much because I got really comfortable with the monolingual dictionary before adding cards, and I liked going about it that way. Some tips and pitfalls some tips that I recommend for people doing monolingual. It's good to have a core 10,000 deck. You can find them online probably handy, because there was a lot of monolingual definition words that were in that core 10,000 deck, and that just made it so that I didn't have to go outside my Anki program to find a sentence. It just made the workflow streamlined, and a lot of the sites that are recommended to go look for sentences have the core 10,000 sentences as their sentences anyway. They have additional sentences also, but I just figured it's easier just to have it right there in the SRS so I can just mark it, and it made it really streamlined. Let's see. Adding inline definitions. One thing I also found really useful was when I came across, because in the beginning, when I came across words that I felt like weren't worth knowing, but I needed to know in order to understand the definition, I just added inline definitions. So like, here's an example of an inline definition. I would have all the words that I knew, and then the word that I didn't know, I would just add in a little definition for it, or a little translation for it. So that way I wouldn't have to look it up and it would just be like really, really fluid. Let's see. I also thought it was weird. Matt said that like monolingual transition should be about 500 vocab. I'm at like 800 and I still feel like I'm only about like 70-80% of the way done. But I feel like some of those aren't actually monolingual vocab. I think that also what you're going to find is that I think by monolingual vocab, he means words that are only important in the monolingual dictionary. I think there was a lot of common words that I didn't know yet that don't technically count as monolingual vocab that I had to learn. So be ready for that. It's not going to be like you're just going to farm 500 sentences from the monolingual dictionary and then be ready to go. You're probably going to end up doing many more than that, but a lot of them are probably common vocab that you don't know yet that aren't considered monolingual vocab. And then some pitfalls to avoid would be, in my opinion, careful about synonyms. I think I added way too many synonyms in the beginning, but they're not really, unless they're like super common synonyms for the word, they're not really beneficial because it's stupid to learn a synonym to learn another word when you could just learn that word instead of its synonym. You know what I mean? So I would just write like little translations to the synonyms or even leave them out completely, unless it's maybe a common one. But I feel like I wasted maybe like, 20 or 30 vocab learning synonyms early on before really kind of catching on that I don't need to learn synonyms unless they're like super common words. Then maybe I would learn the synonym. But I think I learned some like 1-star synonyms when I probably didn't need to because it wasn't essential to the definition. I would have been fine just learning the definition. Also avoid, in the beginning this is unavoidable, but I'm trying now to avoid translating the definitions into an English word. I started off doing this. I'd get really excited when I'd be like, okay, this is the word, or this is the definition. Here's the word I think it is. Then I'd look up the word and be like, oh, I matched the word. But I feel like that's unavoidable in the beginning, but counterproductive. It kind of defeats the purpose because the whole point is to skip English altogether. And I think it's better just to, if you feel like you understand the definition enough to understand the sentence, just kind of live in the blurriness, live in the fuzziness if you can, because just like you'll understand it better if you just let it flesh out through more and more exposure. And then, yeah, that's the monolingual transition. Overall, my overall thoughts with monolingual transition are, I'm really happy I did it. I really, really like functioning monolingual. It was a real pain in the butt. The process was really annoying, and I felt like I'd never get the hang of it. And there's still times where I come across sentences that are just so daunting. I'm just like, or definitions that are so daunting. I'm like, how am I ever going to learn this? And I really didn't like it. But now I'm super happy I did it because the majority of definitions that I come across, I just like that there's no English in the mix, my brain, it doesn't really stop that step of processing, but my brain used to go from like word to English meaning to mentalese. Now it goes from word to definition to mentalese, and eventually it just goes from word to mentalese. It skips that step. So it's not that you're creating less steps, you're just creating less false associations because you're actually getting the Japanese definition instead of this false English equivalent that ends up kind of just making it a little bit more muddied. And I even like looking up words that I already know every now and then just to see the monolingual definition, and it's not always, but it's often quite illuminating, and I really like it. So I think monolingual transition, despite some people saying it's not necessary, I'm really glad I did it now that it's done. Maybe it's not necessary, but I feel like it's quite the benefit. I'm really happy I did it. So, all right, experiments. Last section, experiments. Let's start off. First, I want to start off by saying most people probably shouldn't be running experiments. I like running experiments because I'm willing to sacrifice taking an extra year to learn Japanese in order to understand the process better and try out new things. That's just how I am. I know that most of these things I'm doing are going to be fruitless, as we'll talk about with the 4-tier system. Actually, probably wasted 3 months of my immersion time. But to understand it at a deeper level and just fail at something I thought would be successful and really understand it, I feel like is going to benefit me in the long run because I'm going to learn more than just this language. And plus, I'm an educator. I'm a martial arts instructor. So I definitely find parallels between understanding this at a deeper level and things I can bring into that. So that's kind of why I do experiments. So take these things at a grain of salt. Just know that if you just want to learn it the best, quickest, most efficient way possible, probably best just to follow the official MIA or MattVsJapan recommendations and stay away from my experiments. But some of these I think are pretty good. So check them out and let me know what you think. First of all, 4-tier system. A lot of people were interested in this after my last video. 4-tier system was a big failure. I completely underestimated how much vocab would pile up because of the built-in failure point. Basically what I did is I had 4 tiers. Each tier would be 1 month, and then the last month would be 6 months. So I would first get exposed to a word in audio sentence, audio context. Then, once I passed that up to a month, it would retire, and I'd move it to word level audio. So it would just be the word, and I'd have to recognize the word. Because what I found was, the reason I came up with the 4-tier system is I found that I would know words perfectly in the SRS and still not even recognize them in my immersion. So I wanted to figure out a way to fix that and accelerate the rate that I saw it in immersion, because immersion is where I really acquire words. And it would frustrate me that I would have words that I would be at an 8-month interval that I wouldn't even recognize in immersion as known, because my brain would just process the whole sentence instead of the word. And this system definitely fixed that, but it just made the SRS way too cumbersome and take up way too much time and took away from my immersion, which is the exact opposite of what I want to happen. I want to maximize my immersion through this, not minimize it. So it just ended up being way too many reps and way too much time in the SRS, and just such a bad idea. I thought that because I was taking away 20 and moving it down here, that it would kind of even out over time. Like, it would be a little bit of a bump, but basically what this ensures is that every month, everything has a built-in fail point where it gets reset, and this caused them to stack up. It caused them to stack up, and I just had like hundreds and hundreds of reviews, even though I had a high retention rate. So I stopped doing this, and instead I'm doing the vocab level sentence cards, and I feel like that accomplishes best of both worlds, where it takes away context, it makes me understand and get that dictionary entry started in my brain quicker, to the point where I recognize it in immersion and then flesh out the definitions in immersion. So I'm really liking this. It makes the SRS way more frustrating than doing sentences, but I feel like it's worth that frustration to have better immersion time and get to the point where I'm actually acquiring these words through immersion quicker. But really, really, you have to be okay with the SRS being more annoying if you're going to try this, because it definitely makes the immersion more annoying. Or the SRS more annoying. All right, so the other experiment I'm trying is this peppered information. This is a really kind of... I'm using this add-on called Kanji Eaters Heisig RTK Rebooting. And basically all this does is... This is the add-on Kanji Eaters Heisig. Basically all this does is add my focus. And I'm not testing myself. I'm not like spending a lot of time sitting here trying to cram it, because really the keywords aren't that important. I just have them there as kind of a way to just pepper that information back in. So some pepper information is like, I have this, and then I have the coloring for the pitch accent. Another piece of pepper information that I'll do is confusions. So if you look here, I talked about before how fukuzatsu, I got confused with zashi. So I just added a confusion tab right here, so that way if I get them mixed up, I can compare them right away and just have that information there without having to look it up and take time to look it up. I just have to look it up once, add it to the card, and then I can just compare them if I want to. I don't add this to a lot of cards because it does take time, but ones that I'm getting mixed up quite often, I'll add that so that I can compare them, and that allows my brain to process the difference a little bit better. Let's see. So that's peppered information. Another experiment I'm doing is reading a show that I've watched. So what I do now, and I feel like I'm going to stop doing this in phase 3, but I feel like I'm still bad enough at the language that I benefit from doubling up on it, is I'll watch the show once, and I'll watch it without subtitles, and I'll only look up words that stick out to me, like, oh, I recognize that word, but I don't remember what it is, and then I'll look it up. So I'm like working on acquisition of words through auditory, but I don't add any sentence cards, not through listening. And then what I do is a week later, or no, like 3 weeks later, I'll watch the show again, but I'll watch the show through the subs to SRS deck that I've made of the show, and I'll read it. So I'll read the show. So now I'm testing something different, but on the same show. This allows my brain to notice things that I missed while listening. Like, oh, I didn't notice that, but I know this word. And that makes it just signals to my brain that I missed it and that I should pay attention to that in future immersion. This also makes it really, really easy to sentence mine, because once I come across a word that I want to mine, all I have to do is mark it. I have to mark it, and now I'm ready to go. Oh, I don't know what that word. That's a T1. Mark it, ready to go. So that's why I really like this. And this also blends in with another experiment I'm doing, which is phased content. So another thing I've been trying, and if this gets too complicated, don't worry about it. This is just stupid little things I'm trying. You don't have to worry about it, but if this makes sense to you, maybe try it. So I do phased content in the sense that because I have them all in my thing right here, I'll watch season 1 of a show, and then I'll move on to the next show. And then I'll move on to the next show, and I'll keep watching season 1 of different shows. And then once I'm like, a couple weeks ahead, I'll start reading this show. And then I kind of do that. So I'm reading this one, watching this one, reading this one, watching that one. So I'm sentence mining from this one. And then what will happen is I'll get a good chunk of sentences from that first show. And then once all of those shows are in the mix, once all of those sentences from that first show are in the mix, and I'm actively studying them, well, now I'll go and watch season 2, and I'll cycle through that way, and I'll go back and I'll cycle through, because I find that the similar shows tend to use a lot of the same vocabulary and ideas and grammar structures. So to me, it's really beneficial to mine one season, wait till you've gone through those sentences that you've mined, and then go through the second season. I have a bit of a backlog, so that's why I have to do it that way. Some of you might be able to just do it. You mine the ones that you learn that day. So this might not make sense to any of you, but I have like a backlog that I'm going through. So so that's why, I don't know, it tends to work for me, because I find way more sentences than I can go through in a day. I'll find like 50 a day, but only be able to do 15 or 20. So that's kind of what I'm doing there. And those are kind of some of the experiments I'm doing. And then last thing that I want to talk about is focus sessions. So the other thing that I'm doing is focus sessions. I think I'm going to stop doing this, but I want to talk about it just to give an idea, because I think the only reason that I don't like this anymore is because I don't have the tools to make it worth it. But basically what I'm doing is I have a list of priority words, and those priority words are based off of words that I've already mined. So here's all of my active cards, right? These are all the cards that in my main profile I have, and I have a listening cram and a reading cram button added to them. So what I can do with those keywords is generate priority lists, and then I use that priority list to come up with to run on Morphman on my sentence banks. So then I can do a reading priority cram where I go through and it only finds sentences that contain the words that I prioritize. So if I have problem children words, I usually have like a list of like 800 words that like I currently feel very not comfortable with. I can just go through sentences that really do those. And then once I feel like I'm at the point where it's like, oh, I know this, I don't need this anymore, I really feel like I have a handle on this, I just look for it and remove the tag from it. So now I don't see that anymore the next time that I run Morphman. I really like the results of this, but I don't think it's worth the upkeep of the list. And the only way that I could see this probably continuing on is if I found some way to make a tool, which I don't really feel like making a tool myself because I'm not a good enough programmer and I'd have to learn programming to do it. But if somebody made a tool that allowed me in my browser, in my immersion through all of my different mediums to be able to upkeep this on the fly with a button, I think it'd be very beneficial. But because I have to upkeep the list myself, I'm probably going to stop doing it. And what I did instead is a new experiment that I'm doing, which is 1 week T0 unknown. So as I'm going through my immersion, if I come across a sentence that is T0, so if I come across a sentence that is T0, it has no known objects, but I forgot how to read this, or while I'm listening, I forgot I didn't understand what this word meant, I'll just mark it blue, and then I add that to a list that I study at a week interval. So like literally I'll only be introduced to it one time a week until I get it right. And then it disappears forever. So I don't spend a ton of time on that, but I do think that the repetition of these words I already know in new contexts until I can remember them for a week helps flesh out in a systematic way those words that I already know and accelerate the rate at which they're acquired so that I can understand more of Japanese to get more low-hanging fruit, if that makes sense. Because, obviously, the less you feel like you're drowning in the language, the more you're going to be able to pick out the bits that you don't know so that you can accelerate quicker. So that's kind of my my thought with that. We'll see how that works out. I think that the 1 week T0 sentences is more promising than the focus sessions because it's like zero upkeep. It's literally just mark it and then study it for like 5 minutes a day until you get it. Anyway, that is my 1 year update. And this video was way too long. I very, very much apologize. I wanted to make this shorter, but there was a lot that I wanted to cover. And hopefully you guys found some of the information useful. I hope all of it wasn't a waste of time. But overall, I'm not super happy with my progress over the last 6 months, but I think that was all self-inflicted because of experiments, which I accept, which I know is going to happen, and then focus, which I don't accept, that is unacceptable, that I'm going to work on moving forward. I don't think it's a problem with MIA in any way, shape, or form because I've noticed a huge difference over the last 2 months ever since I really started focusing again and not just seeing immersion as a number to check off, but actually as a goal to learn Japanese. So just keep that in mind. Don't fall into that trap. It seems really common sense, but I do think that you can fall into that trap if you're really busy and having to force yourself to make time to study. Especially if you have your mind on other things. So just really make sure that you're focusing during immersion. And that's all. I'm not going to speak this time because I don't see a lot of benefit in it. Like my pronunciation's a little better, but my output's not going to improve too much until I feel like I'm ready to start making Japanese sentences. I still notice my brain whenever I try and speak constructing the language out of the old grammar rules that I studied before I started MIA. So I don't see a lot of benefit. I have the last 2 updates of me speaking, so I'm going to wait, probably not speak this one, maybe not even speak the next one. I'm going to wait until I'm ready to start outputting, to start showing output progress. So other than that, that's it. Thank you guys for sticking around. I'm really sorry that this ended up going way longer than I expected. I wanted it to be like 25 minutes, but it's like 50 minutes, so I apologize. But we'll see you in 6 months, and I hope you guys at least found a little bit of this interesting or useful.